Black people need to stop blaming the system and take some personal responsibility. Everyone is equal under the law now. They may be policed more, but that's only because they commit a disproportionate amount of the crime. Why? Well, I'm not saying that black people are naturally or more likely to be criminals or anything. I just think it's part of their culture. Why? Well, probably because their dads weren't around to raise them properly. Why? I don't know. Probably because they were too poor to afford a kid, so they left. Why? Well, they probably can't get a good job because they never went to college. Why? Well, I guess it is probably because they couldn't afford it. But they didn't get good enough grades to get a scholarship either. Why? Well, I guess it is probably because their school is underfunded. Why? Because school funding is determined by property taxes and they were born into poor areas. Why? Because their family hasn't been able to build enough wealth to move out. Why? Because the first black people who were born with equal rights under the law are barely 60 years old. The wealth disparity in America has continued to widen. The Forbes 400 in 1982 had 92 to 93 billion dollars, and now they have 5.4 trillion. A number that has grown by a trillion since October 2024. And that number is over 25 times what they had. The trickle-down effect, which is the idea that poor people experience positive effects when rich people get richer and spend more money, has not worked well at all. And with no changes, it can't be expected to improve either. If anything, to put in the words of billionaire Warren Buffett, it's gushed upwards instead, to the point that people think tax rates make us non-competitive in the world, which basically that just means that all the wealth has gone up and none of it's trickled down like it's supposed to, so the rich have gotten richer essentially. Even worse, according to Forbes, titans like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg collectively control nearly $1 trillion, an amount that towers over the combined wealth of the bottom 50% of the population. Yet, while economic inequality impacts all working class Americans, the picture is even grimmer for black communities. The 400 wealthiest white people in the US have the same cumulative amount as all 48.3 million blacks combined. And that's with multiple black billionaires. Let me reiterate, 400 people have the same cumulative amount as 48.3 million black Americans combined. And with that idea being established, are you going to tell me that 400 people have worked harder than 48.3 million black Americans combined? Because there's an idea of capital over labor, which basically means if you own something, it's gonna accumulate more wealth than just putting your labor in. Now, that was kind of a lot of numbers really fast, so let's put that into perspective using time. So I'm gonna ask you a question, and I just want you to think in your head how big that number you think is. So, how many days do you think a million seconds is? The answer is 11. 11 days. So, if a million seconds is 11 days, how many days do you think a billion seconds is? The answer is 32 years. And even after I've looked at the difference between a million and a billion of anything, I still can't put into perspective how insane that difference is. Because based on those numbers, if you earned $1 every second, that means you'd earn $3,600 an hour. And if you earned that 24/7, 365, it would still take you 7,300 years to get up to Jeff Bezos as well. And if you look at the richest person, Elon Musk, 10,599 years. If you made $1 every second. So, despite these crazy numbers being possible, why are black Americans statistically poorer compared to other ethnicities? The overall wealth gap. The economic framework of the United States has, over the decades, evolved into a system where wealth accumulates at the top, as mentioned earlier. A recent statistic shows that the top 1% control more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. A statistic that has only worsened with time. That's from the official Federal Reserve. And this isn't an accidental byproduct of free markets, it's the consequence of decades of policies that favor capital over labor, such as tax cuts for corporations, deregulation, and stagnant wages. And they've created an environment where wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very few people, while millions are struggling to make ends meet. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the gap widened even further. While unemployment soared and many Americans faced unprecedented hardships, billionaires saw their fortunes swell by an estimated $2 trillion. That contrast underscores an economic system designed to reward those who already hold capital while leaving the working class, particularly those from marginalized communities, at a disadvantage. But what happens when this broader wealth disparity intersects with racial discrimination? That brings us to our second story, the specific historical and ongoing factors that have kept Black Americans at an economic disadvantage. The racial wealth gap and its historical roots. The roots of the racial wealth gap in America can be traced back to discriminatory policies that systematically excluded Black families from wealth-building opportunities. One of the most egregious practices was redlining. Beginning in 1930s, redlining was the act of government-backed agencies drawing circles around areas to classify neighbors as they saw fit. The agencies used it to classify predominantly poverty-stricken areas as Black neighborhoods, which were hazardous for investment. So, to make this more clear, they would choose an area that was typically more poor or worn out, and they would classify it as a Black neighborhood. So when a Black American went to go for a loan or something of that sort from a bank, the bank would deny it, and so they wouldn't be able to afford or put down any money for the nicer areas where the typically white people were buying into. So because of these circles, banks and mortgage lenders use these maps to deny Black families access to home loans, even in places where they could actually afford them. But that meant Black families could only buy smaller, less valuable houses, and anytime they tried to apply for a loan, they were just denied outright. And so those loans were typically the nicer areas designated by the white areas. And because of redlining, these borders between neighborhoods effectively denied them the primary vehicle of wealth accumulation, which is home ownership. Even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, an act that just got rid of all the areas and outlawed overt redlining, its legacy persisted. Because generations of Black families were denied the chance to invest in appreciating real estate, a privilege that allowed white families to accumulate wealth and pass it down through generations. But today, studies show that the average white family holds roughly 8 times the wealth of an average Black family. And there are other studies that say 13 times, but I went on a kind of conservative side, so we're going to say 8. And this isn't simply a matter of individual financial management, it's a systemic failure rooted in policies that have left Black communities at a permanent disadvantage. Whereas majorities have had hundreds of years to accumulate generational wealth for themselves and their future generations, Black communities have not been given that opportunity. These historical injustices explain why, even decades after legal segregation ended, the oldest person born free from segregation in America is only 61 years old. Something that isn't fully realized in modern society. It hasn't been that long since segregation ended. So to put expectations that it's just gonna fix after some of these laws and things that ended segregation is unfair. Ultimately, the policies that created vast concentrations of wealth didn't operate in isolation. They were implemented alongside exclusionary practices that targeted Black communities. Some have insisted that wealth inequality is the result of nothing more than individual choices and the stock market fluctuation, pointing to the likes of personal financial decisions or abilities of individuals. But for the longest times, systemic barriers and historical inequalities that have been unfair to Black communities, especially redlining and discriminatory lending practices. However, this perspective overlooks the systemic barriers and historical injustices that have gravely affected Black communities. However, examining the intersections of race and class offers a different perspective. While economic policies impact everyone, discriminatory practices like redlining have built additional barriers for Black Americans. Therefore, the wealth gap is both an economic and racial issue, a dual crisis requiring holistic solution. Furthermore, evidence indicates that strategies aimed at reducing economic inequality are likely to fall short if they fail to address racial disparities. Confronting the legacies of discriminatory policies and making access to credit, education, and jobs essential. By addressing and rectifying the historical factors that have excluded Black communities from wealth creation, we can begin to close the racial wealth gap. But many things have collectively stifled generation wealth building opportunities, and it will take a long time to rectify those things. The wealth gap in America reflects an economic system that rewards capital accumulation, while the racial wealth gap highlights how historical injustices continue to shape economic realities today. So, what can we actually do? Well, I'm sure there's more mathematical solutions, but real changes require breaking down the negative stereotypes and social norms that build barriers for minorities from accessing wealth creating opportunities. Today, Those barriers are student debt, rising prices of the housing market, and we need to make sure that the 350 million Americans are able to live with enough on minimum wage. If we can lower the cost of goods for consumers and make houses affordable like other countries can, it is completely possible to allow wealth to accumulate for the minorities that still haven't had a chance to. By addressing these, we move closer to building a fair, more equal society for all Americans.